So the Indiana Fever almost certainly protected Sophie Cunningham. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in terms of what it means for the Fever, what it means for the rest of the league, what it means just in general, because I do feel like this is kind of an important thing because of the way it looks like the Fever are going about things.
Let's settle this right now. The Indiana Fever's expansion draft protection list should not be a mystery. In fact, if you've been paying even half attention to this roster, to the new expansion draft rules, and to how this league actually works, the answers are obvious. And if the Fever front office somehow managed to get this wrong, we're talking full-scale panic mode. Not exaggeration, not hyperbole. Fire the front office on the spot. I mean that sincerely. If they manage to screw up something this straightforward, the accountability conversation has to happen. Now, before we dive into the list, I want to throw out one unpopular opinion. And I know this is going to generate some debate. Christy Wallace. Yes, I said it. Look, she was not a good starter. That much is true, and nobody's arguing otherwise. But here's what people keep forgetting. Christy Wallace shot 40% from three the year before, and she averaged 17.5 points in her last meaningful stretch of basketball. As an end-of-bench player on a minimum deal, that's a different conversation entirely. If she came back on a 2-year minimum contract as a spot-up shooter who knows her role, I wouldn't be violently opposed to protecting her over KK Timpson. I'm not saying it's the right move. I'm saying it's not as crazy as people think, but ultimately, the Fever are going to protect KK, and that's probably the correct call. We'll get to why shortly. So let's just say it plainly. Here's the Fever protection list in order of obviousness and why every single decision essentially makes itself. Caitlin Clark, obviously. Do we even need to discuss this? She is the franchise player. She is the reason this team sells out arenas. She's the reason we're having this conversation at all. She is the reason the WNBA is experiencing a cultural moment that the league hasn't seen in decades. Caitlin Clark is untouchable. Any expansion franchise that even thinks about using a pick on her has fundamentally misunderstood what they're doing and who they're dealing with. This one doesn't require debate. Aaliyah Boston. Obviously, if the Fever let Aaliyah Boston slip into an expansion draft pool unchecked, that is grounds for immediate termination. No questions asked, no severance necessary. She is precisely the kind of two-way player that championship rosters are built around. Elite interior presence, smart on-ball defense, elite basketball IQ, and she's still getting better. Aaliyah and Caitlin represent the foundational core of what the Fever are building. Protecting her isn't even a decision. It's a reflex. It should happen automatically without anyone in the front office losing a single night of sleep.
All right, guys, it is official. The WNBA expansion draft for its two newest teams, the Toronto Tempo and Portland Fire, is over. They have their rosters. We got to break this down. The Indiana Fever lost 2 players in this expansion draft.
Lexi Hall. Obviously, this one is a bit different, but it's just as clear cut. The Fever hold her rights, and protecting those rights matters. You don't give up a young, athletic wing whose ceiling hasn't been fully explored yet. Lexi Hall is the kind of player who fits perfectly around Caitlin Clark. She can space the floor, she plays with energy, and her motor never stops. She's the type of player you build depth with. When you hold rights to someone like that, you don't hand them over to an expansion team for free. Protect Lexi Hall. This is not a gray area. KK Timpson. Yes, actually KK Timpson. Now here's where the fan base gets a little divided. KK Timpson is young, she's raw, she hasn't exactly set the professional world on fire yet, and there are legitimate questions about her timeline. But here's the thing, somebody is going to see the potential in KK Timpson. There is no way in a league where young athletic talent is as scarce as it is that an expansion team doesn't look at her as a high upside developmental piece. The worst case scenario for protecting her. She doesn't develop the way you hoped, and 2 years from now, you trade her for a second round pick to a team that still believes in her upside. Some organization out there is going to value what the Fever see in her. You don't give that leverage away for nothing. Protect KK Timpson. Now let's talk about the player everyone seems to be losing their minds over, Sophie Cunningham, and why this entire debate is almost completely pointless. Let me be direct here because the discourse around Sophie and the expansion draft has gone completely off the rails, and I think people are fundamentally misunderstanding 2 things: how expansion drafts actually work and how player movement functions in this league. If Sophie Cunningham wants to go play for the Toronto expansion franchise or the Portland franchise or anywhere else, she is going. Full stop. The expansion draft does not change that equation one single bit. If a team is willing to use a pick on her and then offer her $1.2 million or close to it, and she wants to take that money and start fresh somewhere new, she is gone. That's the reality of professional sports. Players go where they want to go, and they go where they feel valued. Now here's the flip side of that coin. If Sophie Cunningham wants to stay in Indiana, and there are plenty of reasons she is staying, because expansion teams historically do not load up on veterans who have genuine ties to their current franchises and zero interest in relocating. These teams are building a foundation, not running heist operations on unwilling veterans. So the whole conversation about whether the Fever should or shouldn't burn a protection slot on Sophie, almost entirely irrelevant to the actual outcome. If she wants to leave, she leaves. Expansion draft or free agency, the destination is the same. If she wants to stay, no expansion team wastes a valuable early selection on a player who has made it clear she'd rather be somewhere else. Here's an analogy that might help clarify this. Think back to when another team had a veteran who got offered a maximum contract from a different franchise and left anyway. The expansion draft protection status meant nothing because the player had already made up her mind. Sophie Cunningham's situation isn't fundamentally different. The draft protections only matter if she's genuinely on the fence. And if she's on the fence, the money will decide it regardless of what the Fever's protection list looks like. What actually matters is that the Fever use every protection slot with purpose and intentionality. Protecting Sophie over a developmental piece like KK Timpson when Sophie is almost certainly making her own decision regardless is the kind of reactive, fear-based roster management that sets franchises back for years. Protect your young core. Protect your rights holders. Protect upside, not the status quo. Bree Turner, let her walk. This isn't disrespect. Bree has had a solid, respectable WNBA career, and nobody's taking that away from her. But the Fever are building for the next championship window, and Bree Turner doesn't fit into that 3 to 5 year plan at the level you'd need to justify a protection slot. Free agency exists for exactly this scenario. If she lands somewhere good and contributes for a few more years, that's a great story. But this roster slot has to be used on the future. Same goes for Dantas. Let her walk. Every protection slot is a resource, and resources are finite. You don't spend them on players who aren't central to your long-term core. That's just fundamental roster construction, and the Fever have no excuse for getting it wrong. Now let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture, because I think the casual fan is dramatically overestimating how chaotic and roster disrupting this expansion draft is actually going to be. The expansion teams entering this draft are not walking in and dismantling championship contenders. They're not pulling established stars away from teams who have meaningful relationships with those players. The history of WNBA expansion drafts tells us one very clear story. The vast majority of players selected are names that most fans have never even heard of. Fringe roster players, developmental prospects, athletes who were going to be released in training camp anyway, international stash players who may or may not ever play a minute in the WNBA. Think about the league landscape right now. The Atlanta Dream might lose a player like Borlase in this process. The Chicago Sky could see Koulibaly, a player they drafted last year who hasn't broken through yet, walk out the door. The New York Liberty might lose Raquel or Photo. These are not franchise cornerstones. These are depth pieces that give expansion franchises something to evaluate while they build the right way. Through the draft, through free agency, through smart roster construction over time. And honestly, expansion teams can end up with something genuinely useful. I remember when the last expansion class got completely roasted online, people were saying it was the worst group ever assembled, calling the whole process a failure. And I was posting in real time that people weren't looking carefully enough. If everything came together and those players developed the way they could, that team had something to build on. Expansion drafts aren't always the disasters that casual observers make them out to be. They're just rarely the blockbuster roster reshufflings that fans imagine. The bottom line is this: the Indiana Fever's protection list is not a puzzle. It is not a complex strategic problem requiring deep analysis and sleepless nights. It's Clark, Boston, Hull, and Timpson. Beyond that, you let the other pieces sort themselves out and trust that the players with genuine reasons to stay in Indiana will stay, because the expansion draft isn't forcing their hand anyway. Stop panicking. Stop overcomplicating what should be a simple exercise in protecting your most valuable assets. The Fever front office has a clear, obvious, and logical path directly in front of them, and the only way they fail is by second guessing themselves into a mistake. Indiana, don't be dumb. Just do the obvious thing.